My name is Rob Doubleday. I said that before. I am a director of the Centre for Science and Policy and a BiPhil at Christ College. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this, the fourth and final seminar in this year's Christ's Climate Seminar Series, which has focused on achieving change for population and planetary health post-pandemic. The series has been a collaboration between Professor Dame Theresa Marteau, behavioural scientist and fellow of Christ College, and as it happens, the co-chair of the Lancet Chatham House Commission that's looked at some of these questions, and Professor Charlie Kennel, who's a distinguished visiting scholar to Christ College and an emeritus professor at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And so it's great that we'll be joined by both Theresa and Charlie during this discussion. I'd also like to introduce briefly the 4 Christ College students who've listened to the previous 3 seminars and are going to be giving their highlights and reflecting on what were for them the most important themes to emerge. Ian Holdroyd, 4th year medical student, Alice Ginn, a final year engineering student, Lucy Gardner, again a 4th year medical student, and Camille McCarthy, who's a 1st year languages student and the Christ College student environment officer, green officer. So you 4 are very welcome. And we're delighted also to welcome Fiona Harvey, environment correspondent at The Guardian, who, as it happens, is also a former student of Christ College. So you're very welcome back, Fiona. Fiona has had a distinguished career in journalism that has, in the last years, focused on environmental questions. And I'm sure all of you will be reading on Fiona's important journalism, which is coming out and is more important than ever from The Guardian at the moment. So we're very grateful to have Fiona reflect on some of the themes that the students have picked out. So with those brief words of introduction, I will now turn just to 1 or 2 quick housekeeping arrangements, just to say that this is in webinar mode, so you can put your questions in the Q&A box and you can upvote questions that you like. And I will then put those questions to the panel. Please also use the comment function if you want to make a comment. And this will be recorded, and a recording of this discussion we put up on the Centre for Science and Policy website, so you can refer to it again. So with that, I will hand over to Theresa Marteau.
Many thanks, Rob. I'm just going to say a couple of words about the Lancet Chatham House Commission, which stimulated this seminar series of the Christ seminar series on climate change. The Commission was born of the observation that the major threats to population and planetary health are closely interlinked. Infectious disease, which we've experienced, particularly zoonotic disease. We're in the middle of a pandemic of a zoonotic disease, Covid-19, intimately linked to what we can call a pandemic of non-communicable disease, a global pandemic with high and rising rates of type 2 diabetes, various cancers, and the climate and the environment emergencies. And on the Commission, what we're interested in doing is starting with some of the drivers that are common across those 3 major threats, such as unsustainable farming, subsidies on fossil fuels, to identify actions that could work across those 3 threats, which could be transformative if we manage to find some of the right actions. But as we all know, identifying what to do is not the end of it. We also need to think about how to frame, how to engage decision makers as well as populations in implementing those actions. And that is what this seminar series is focused on, and that's what we're going to hear more about. So just as a brief synopsis, in the first seminar, we looked at how to frame the costs of action and inaction, whether to use monetary values on top of nature, or a moral argument would be enough. So we had Diane Coyle as an economist and Michael Marmot, an epidemiologist, talking about that. In the second seminar, we looked at engaging the public voice much more, looking at digital democracy, and we had the digital minister from Taiwan, Audrey Tang, talking with Jeff Margan. And in the final seminar, we talked about place, and in particular, the balance between national government, central government, and local decision makers through the lens of some public health experts, Janelle de Gruchy and Chris Ham, talking about COVID-19. So I'm delighted that here we are to pull together some of those themes and introduce some more today. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you, Theresa. And so now we'll turn to the 4 students who won the opportunity to reflect on the seminars and speak to us now in a competition that saw many Christ students apply to contribute. So thank you very much, Ian, Alice, Lucy and Camille. So I'll turn to you in order of the seminars that you particularly followed. So we'll just go first to Ian and then just go straight through. So Ian.
Thanks, Rob. I, as mentioned, had the role of reporting on the first of the 4 seminars, which addressed the best methods in which we can frame the case for post-pandemic change, paying special attention to the relative efficacy of moral arguments and arguments based off metrics. In my time now, I'm just going to quickly describe why we need metrics. I'll give an example of why metrics could be improved, or how they could be improved rather, before finally just quickly concluding that metrics alone won't be enough, hence why we require a concurrent moral argument. So why do we need metrics? Well, it was argued that metrics are the lens through which we see the world and through which we tell stories. Therefore, if we do fail to measure something, then ultimately we do fail to capture its very existence. Additionally, it was argued that metrics are the ways in which we build knowledge. While metrics were agreed to be vital, we really do need to improve the current tools that we have in order to measure economies like this. Measurements such as GDP were argued to not well enough correlate with the ways in which people truly think of prosperity in the 21st century. One of the ways in which we could improve our use of metrics was described in the form of a wealth economy framework. Here, finances of governments or even businesses don't actually just operate by a profit and loss account, but by a balance sheet comprised of a range of comprised of a portfolio of assets. Such assets would include things like access to infrastructure and technology, environmental resources, human health, education, skills, and social cohesion. The use of such a framework would allow policymakers to rationalise a wider range of ideas which would place both inter and intra-generational social justice as well as sustainability right at the heart of decision making. Even with these improved metrics, they alone won't be enough. And a good example of why so can be seen with the example of climate change, where we need to address problems right at the global level. Our globalized economy, separating locations of production and consumption, results in some nations disproportionately consuming high levels of natural resources compared to the social, economic, and environmental consequences that they're actually going to experience. Due to that, for us, in a more economically developed country, simply developing metrics to measure our personal future costs of current societal or government inaction doesn't actually show the real consequences for said inaction. It's for that reason that alongside improved metrics, we do require a concurrent moral argument to really prove the true need for post-pandemic change. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ian. Very succinct pulling out of an important thread of that seminar. Thank you, Ian. And then I'll go next to Alice Jin, who is going to pull a theme from the discussion about digital democracy and participation.
Thanks, Rob. So the second seminar that I covered centered around the topic of digital democracy, which is the use of digital technologies to complement democracies, such as e-petition sites and online citizen assemblies. Audrey Tang, Digital Minister of Taiwan, and Sir Jeff Morgan provided tremendous insight into how digital tools could complement current democracies and how it's already successfully being done in Taiwan. If I had to choose a single key takeaway, it would be about how openness can help build a culture of two-way trust needed for digital democracy to be successful. The emphasis is on two-way. The government has to be transparent and accountable to its people to earn their trust, both in terms of making data readily available and communicating policies unambiguously. At the same time, the government needs to readily place trust in its people's expertise and intentions to establish meaningful conversations and fruitful collaborations between the public service and civic sector. For instance, in the case of Taiwan, the government provided daily factual briefings about the COVID-19 situation early on in the outbreak and trusted civic hackers sufficiently to work with them to develop a mask inventory app that allowed citizens to find out mask inventory levels at pharmacies near them. The benefits reaped are that people can voice their concerns about day-to-day matters and attain a more powerful representation at the governmental level beyond simply voting in elections every couple years. And for the government, they are able to tap on the wide expertise and collective intelligence of its population to better inform its own decision-making. We have to keep in mind that this culture of trust has to be developed and inculcated over time. It doesn't just happen overnight. Digital tools may in fact further divide populations rather than engage them meaningfully, just like what we saw happen in the States in recent years. Initiatives such as engaging citizens on local issues and reforming education, for instance, by teaching students how to spot misinformation and encouraging them to report any such instances, coupled with increasing transparency of governments to the inspection of its people. These could be effective first steps. Likewise, reliable digital platforms connecting the people and the government require time to establish as well, and digital tools ought to be introduced and integrated into every level of a democracy. Extrapolating this to climate change, a similar culture of two-way trust has to be developed, as environmental policies are often enacted from both national scales and at local levels. Open cooperation and collaboration between the government and its people helps ensure societies and countries as a whole can progress forward to a cleaner, greener future in a sustainable manner. In a similar vein, openness in the international setting and mutual trust propagating through international networks are required for uniform action, where countries can help hold each other accountable.
Yeah, fantastic, Alice. Thank you very much. You can already kind of hear some of the connections between the points that are being brought out here, which I hope we'll come to in the discussion. But let's move now straight on to Lucy Gardner, who followed in particular the session that looked at local decision making and how that related to national decision making. Lucy.
Brilliant, thanks, Rob. Yeah, so for me, the key takeaway from my seminar was kind of the benefits that can be found by increasing the frequency at which we kind of drop the decisions down to a local level. So whilst we here have a very centralised system, maybe by passing on decisions, it's more probable we achieve what are actually better outcomes. So when I say this, I mean well-being, health, and reducing inequality. So an example of this which was drawn on was in the very first lockdown, we eased it, and this was a central decision, but there were still lots of disparities in infection rates across the country. So maybe there was some kind of bias here, which didn't reflect what local decisions kind of would have been made had they made them separately. So for me, the key things to achieve this ability to make decisions at the local level are firstly, a good way of measuring outcomes such that success of local decisions are actually acknowledged. And secondly, some kind of willingness from the government to actually pass on that decision making. So I think that actually it's the discrepancy between the aims of local and central government which leads to issues with this quantification. So a point that really stuck in my mind was that during the pandemic, there were massive discharges from hospitals in the motto of save the NHS. So this was a government aim, but it neglected the fact that you were discharging all these people to care homes, and this led to outbreaks and mass deaths. So here could we be somewhat hitting a target and missing a point? So again, now aiming for a particular number to be vaccinated. But if we're vaccinating 75% of a target group, yet not the other 25%, who aren't we vaccinating? And is this just leading to further inequalities? So actually kind of relating back to seminar 1, is there some way we can quantify this? So maybe placing a number on these outcomes or a push from the public of their importance. So the second point I said was about willingness from the government. And one of the panelists actually mentioned a paper he wrote, which was Place-Based Systems of Care in 2015. And here he stated that to achieve this system, that organisational leaders must surrender some of their autonomy in pursuit of the populations they collectively serve. Now, I think this has truth in many aspects of dropping down decisions locally. In the pandemic, there seemed some kind of unwillingness, and lots of decisions were made by central government, few, not the many. Furthermore, local governments are often the first to receive the cuts. But these place-based systems have started to emerge in the NHS over the past few years. So maybe with enough kind of push and encouragement, along with some kind of quantification of the local achievements, we could actually allow this power of decision-making to be shared and spread rather than just all centrally, somewhat more locally.
Great, thank you, Lucy. And your points in that seminar turned out to be very timely with the announcements about potential changes to the way NHS is organised. So it's very interesting to see what elements of the points you've drawn out are going to be reflected in those debates and those reforms. We should watch carefully. Thank you, Lucy. Camille.
Yes, hello. So my job for this seminar series was to report on the areas where different speakers' ideas converged and what sort of common solutions speakers came up to for achieving more effective change making, both in terms of dealing with the public health crisis that is COVID-19, as well as thinking more generally about crisis management and how this can be applied, perhaps most notably to the climate crisis. There are sort of 4 main ideas I found emerged from the discussions, the first being trusting in expertise and experience in the population. Speakers across all 3 seminars affirmed and reaffirmed that the knowledge required for efficient and well-informed decision-making already resides in the population, and that it's merely a question of accessing this, whether it be through restructuring power to allow more local initiatives, or through introducing digital schemes to allow individual citizens to participate in decisions. In a similar vein, speakers stressed the importance of listening to experience. This was touched upon, especially during the first seminar, as Ian has spoken about, where we talked about the use of qualitative data, i.e. listening to experiences and testimonies as an essential factor, both in understanding problems and in motivating the powers that be to act. The second main point that came out was about how everyone has a role to play, that being that every level of government has a role to play. We talked lots about the local, the regional and the national, leading all the way up to the international stage. While speakers tended to agree that a revalorization of local power was necessary, they also stressed that regional and national governments' roles were indispensable to effectively enacting change. That is to say that a reconsideration of who is best placed to deal with various issues seems to be necessary to ensure the efficiency of future policies. The third point that came out was about thinking holistically, both by considering our democracy as a system, as a mosaic of institutions, and therefore considering horizontal as well as vertical thinking, but also by thinking holistically about the impacts of our institutions and of their policies. This links back again to the question of metrics and morality, putting people over profit, and it also reaffirms the idea that we need to redefine our narrow conception of success that is currently too overly based on economic models. The final issue that speakers touched on frequently was the question of intergenerational thinking and the need for optimism. For example, how can we achieve the long-term change we need and find in this necessary intergenerational momentum in a system where our government and its priorities change every 4 years? And I think that COVID-19 has revealed to us the weaknesses and inequalities in our systems by heightening any and every existing problem. But speakers agreed that it showed us also about our capacity for community engagement, mutual aid, solidarity across borders. And so it may sound cliche, but the overall message we can take away from these seminars is one of cautious hope. The ideas I've spoken about holistic thinking, everyone playing a role, and relying and trusting experience and expertise, all centre around revitalising people's faith in our democracy and in our institutions by encouraging participation, improving channels of communication so that national government has better feedback, local government has more agency, and citizens have their voices heard. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Camille. I think that very eloquently ties some of the major threads together. So Fiona, over to you. Now, you've heard these 4 takes on what the students felt were some of the most sort of pressing and interesting issues to emerge. How do you then react to that, and how do you place some of the things you've heard in the context of the kind of ecological crises that we know we're facing at the moment?
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for this marvelous seminar series. Actually, I mean, it's wonderful to have had such great seminars and such wonderful individuals taking part. You know, some very high-profile people that we've heard from, and it's really great that you, Bob, and Theresa, and Charlie have done this, and well done on our students for winning the competition. I've been taking notes through that. Lucky I have shorthand because there was an awful lot going on. And what really strikes me is how timely this is actually at the moment, because this is a crucial year this year for the climate and for biodiversity. We've got COP26 coming up, which the UK will host in Glasgow in November, hoping that Glasgow is still part of the UK by November. And that's going to be enormously important for the whole world, because it's 5 years since the Paris Agreement was signed, and we haven't made the progress towards the goals of Paris that we need to. We've had some great developments in the past 6 months, which a year ago we really didn't think looked likely. So really important. We've had China sign up to net zero emissions by 2060. We've had a lot of other countries, the EU set out their plans and committed to their plans for net zero by 2050. UK, of course, as well. We've had Japan, South Korea do the same. We've had the election of Joe Biden in the United States with a huge difference to the US rule, because of course under Donald Trump they tried to withdraw, but they're withdrawing from Paris, and Joe Biden has immediately reversed that. So we have a lot of progress. Now 2/3 of global emissions are coming from countries that have a pledge of net zero by mid-century. However, having a mid-century pledge is all very well, but it won't get us to where we need to, because the next 10 years will be crucial. And you know, as we all know here, it's the cumulative emissions between now and 2050 that are important. We can't continue emitting at the rate we are until 2049 and then bring them all down really quickly, because the cumulative emissions between now and then will be too great. They will take us over the threshold that would take us to more than 2 degrees, more than 2 degrees temperature increase. So what we do in the next 10 years is really important. And COP26 in Glasgow will look at that as well. Countries will have to set out their NDCs, nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, which are for emissions cuts or curbs in the next 10 years to 2030. So that's what we've got to play for. And this, what we've heard this afternoon and in the previous seminars, ties into that very much. We've already, well, Camille has done a great job of drawing together a lot of those threads. So let me just tease out a few of them. Looked at the metrics, the question of metrics, and of course we've got some great new work on that that's just come out from Sir Partha Dasgupta, who has looked at biodiversity and how we can look at natural capital and the costs and benefits of natural capital. So essentially it's trying to fit ideas of natural capital, diversity, and the ecosystem services, the good things that we get from nature, pretty essential, like clean air and clean water and food and so on that keep us alive. And the other things that we might be less conscious of, but that also keep us alive, like the biodiversity, the ecosystems, the oceans, and so on. And how the harm our current economic model does to those goods and those goods and systems. So for instance, looking at the way in which, not just the way in which we change the climate, but also the way in which we pollute, the way in which we destroy habitats for other species and so on. That is hugely important, and it ties in very nicely to this idea of metrics, because I remember I've been reporting in the environment for 15 years, and one of the most important things that's happened in that time was the Stern review led by Nicholas Stern in 2005, which set out how it made economic sense to tackle climate change. Now, it's really obvious that it makes economic sense to tackle climate change, because if we don't tackle climate change, then we won't have a livable planet. And if we don't have a livable planet, we won't have an economy. So it kind of makes sense. You can see that from the outset. But what he did, which was incredibly important, was that he went down into the fine detail, and he established within current economic accounting and current economic practice how the economics of climate change worked, how the costs and the benefits could be calculated within that existing framework. That was hugely influential, and it made an enormous difference, because it spoke to governments about climate change in a language they could understand. Because previously they had environmentalists and scientists speaking to them about this, but it didn't really quite work within their existing mindsets and economic frameworks. It was when it was presented to them in a way that worked within the economic frameworks that they understood, that they could then begin to understand, and eventually actually move beyond the constrictions of those frameworks to a better understanding. And that, I think, is what we're seeing here with the Dasgupta review, looking at biodiversity and the whole of nature, and how we exist on the planet, taking in not just climate change, but also, as I said, these issues like pollution, species, or encroachment on habitats and so on. So that's really important, and that's why I think that the discussion of that was particularly timely. Also this year, of course, we've got a big, as well as the COP26 Climate Summit, we've got a big conference on biodiversity. It was supposed to take place last year in China. It's been postponed to this year by the pandemic, and that will be hugely important in setting out the global actions on biodiversity for the coming decades. So we can see how important it is that we look at those metrics right now. I was particularly drawn as well to your discussions about digital democracy and how that works in relation to climate activism. As I said, we're leading up to COP26 in Glasgow, and at the moment we don't really know exactly how that's going to work. Everyone is hoping for a normal physical face-to-face conference, but by November there will probably still be some restrictions in place at the very least. And they will be looking to do an awful lot of that conference virtually in terms of outreach and so on, not in terms of the negotiations themselves. because, you know, we're still hoping that world leaders will convene on Glasgow. But in terms of a lot of the communication, I think they will be looking to do a lot of it digitally. So that participation and civil society participation is incredibly important. I've been attending UNFCCC COPs since 2004, and I can tell you that really the pressure that you get from civil society at a COP is a crucial ingredient of getting any kind of progress. We saw that at Paris. We've seen that since. We saw, you know, in the last COP that they had was in 2019 in December in Madrid. And it was extraordinary, the contrast between the people inside the halls, the negotiators, making very little progress, getting bogged down in, you know, working out where semicolons could be placed in a paragraph of text, that kind of level of detail. While outside, there were 500,000 people led by Greta Thunberg saying, come on, we need you to make progress now. So we really can't underestimate the importance of civil society participation in climate change discussions. And so that discussion that you had was incredibly important for that. And I'd also just like to say that the pandemic, which we've referred to as well, has revealed something really important about the relationship between individuals and governments on climate change. We talked about, Lucy, you told us about the relations between local and national governments looking at climate change. And one of the key relationships as well is between individual citizens and the wider economy when we look at climate change. Because what we saw from the pandemic was that greenhouse gas emissions plunged because of the lockdowns. They came down by between 25% and 30%, sometimes even slightly more in some economies, last April, when the lockdowns were really biting. And that was hugely important. It won't make any difference to climate change in the longer term, the fact that emissions came down then, but it revealed something really vital, which is that even when global economies had shut themselves down effectively to a minimum, when people weren't leaving their houses, when airplanes had been grounded, when lots of industry had come to a standstill, even so, 75% of emissions remained intact. What does that say? Well, it tells us that individual decisions can only go so far in terms of combating climate change, and that actually we need systemic change. And that systemic change needs to be managed by local and national governments, and just putting the emphasis on individuals and our actions is not enough. And that's really a key point that has come out of this. We also, well, we've covered a huge amount of ground there, and we also looked at the fact that we, and as Camille noted again, we do have the knowledge to combat this problem. We have the structures sometimes. We need probably more and better structures, but we do have some of them. And really, a lot of it now is to do with the will and the sense of urgency. And so the final point that I'd like to make in trying to kind of draw some of these themes together in this crucial year is that we're coming out we're slowly emerging from the pandemic as we get vaccinated and so on, and we learn how to deal with this terrible disease. But it will take a while. But how we do that is going to be crucial. Because, you know, again, I reported on the financial crisis in 2008. And at that time, governments were telling us that the recovery from that financial crisis was going to be green. And at that time, just as they did last year, emissions fell sharply for a year. And what happens next was absolutely crucial, because the governments who had trumpeted their green credentials and said that, you know, they were going to we didn't have the phrase build back better then, but people did talk about a green recovery and the need to reduce emissions when we reflated the economy. That didn't happen to the extent that was needed. We had a study a couple of years after the financial crisis that found that despite all the rhetoric, only about 15% of the economic recovery measures that were put in place after that financial crisis were genuinely green and led to low carbon developments. The rest, the vast majority of the trillions of government money that was spent in the wake of the financial crisis went to projects in industries and parts of the economy that actually increased emissions. And so what we saw then was that the decline in emissions was just a temporary blip, and emissions went on after that, not only to grow year on year, but to increase their rate of growth. We don't have time to make a mistake like that again. And so this year, it is absolutely crucial that we have a genuine green recovery from the COVID-19 crisis, from the recession that a lot of countries have been plunged into. We have choices, and we know what those choices are, and we know what are the right choices to make. We know that there are ways of building back better. We had a fantastic paper came out of Oxford last May by Stiglitz and various others, looking at how we could have a green recovery from COVID, and establishing that a green recovery would do more for jobs and people's livelihoods and people's well-being and prosperity, both in the short and the long term. So really, we have no excuses now. And yeah, if there's something that we need to do in the next year, then it is to have that green recovery. Thank you.
Very well, thank you so much, Fiona. I mean, you commented on and augmented the points that students made really helpfully, and also then added that important sense of urgency and made clear why now is the time to grasp these questions. So thank you, Fiona. And we've had several good questions posed already. So it's difficult because we've got so many good people on our panel, but I'm going to just, if you want to answer a particular question, just wave at me, but I will proceed by several of the questions have focused on questions about participation. So let me begin, Alice, by turning to you, if I may. So the first question from an anonymous said, there's been a lot of emphasis on the importance of participation in decision-making at different levels. And thinking about the United Kingdom, and UK is not alone, but let's take the United Kingdom, there's clearly a lot more needs to be done to improve participation, and there are risks if this has got wrong. Do you have any suggestion about where to start? You know, what is the next step down the road? Do you have any thoughts, Alice?
So it was actually brought up in the seminar that the UK was initially quite resistant to the transition to a digital democracy, but eventually necessity sort of kicked in, and parliaments had to occur online simply because they couldn't meet face to face. So I think this is the transition that is happening very slowly. But at the same time, how can we sort of encourage this pace to pick up? How do we allow citizen voice to be heard more loudly and more frequently? So in the seminar, an interesting thought experiment was posed to us, saying that if we thought back to a couple months ago, maybe say in March, what would have happened if the government actually consulted the people rather than made decisions within themselves? Would they actually have made better decisions? And it turns out from the polls judging people's response at the time, it turns out that when dealing with complex decisions, say deciding when to have a lockdown, or the decision to shut down schools, the people collectively actually made a better choice than governments. So I think that's the importance of citizen voice there. As to how we can start, it might be quite scary to start on national level policies like that. So a very good idea is to start, say, at a council level. So for instance, in your local area, how do we make use of public space? Perhaps we could start engaging citizens, the people living there. see if they have any ideas about how to more effectively utilize public space, get them to start discussing issues that are pertinent to their daily lives, something that they can more easily relate to. And then once we get them involved, we can slowly ramp up the participation to higher and higher levels, eventually hoping to reach the national level.
Great, thank you, Alice. And that definitely echoes the point you made about, trust, and two-way trust is something that's built and earned over time, so that your answer about sort of starting somewhere concrete and building from there, it seems to make sense. Theresa, I wondered if you wanted to comment on that question, perhaps link it to another question we had, which is about sort of inclusiveness. So, are there risks of sort of digital democracy or other attempts at participation that you get the more privileged voices coming into the discussion? Theresa.
Yes, just to pick up where Alice stopped, and in that seminar there was quite a discussion about the difference between Taiwan and the UK in terms of digital engagement and trust, and that two-way trust and openness that Alice has emphasized. And what we heard from Audrey Tang was that when the pandemic started, these platforms were already up and running, and there was an openness and a relationship between the people and those who were making decisions, governments, which we don't have. That isn't replicated in the UK. So as well as thinking where we might start in the UK and thinking local, as Alice was saying, the other place to think about where we could start is with children and younger people. And this is a point that Jeff Mulgan made. And I think it's important when we think about intergenerational justice. Also in that seminar, the issues of, I think it was data competence was talked about. And there are some interesting experiments that have been done whereby, I think it's Friends of the Earth who've run some of these, where you have children at school who are collecting data on local air pollution. So learning how to collect those data to become citizen scientists themselves. So embedding this at every single level so that we become much more engaged, both in seeing data, thinking about solutions, as well as becoming involved in democratic process. And as Alice so neatly underscored, this is openness and it's a two-way trust.
Thank you. Fiona, I wonder, what do you make of the Climate Change Assembly, which was quite a significant, I think, effort at participation at a national level in the UK on climate change, and in many ways it seemed to have been a very effective forum, as I understand it, for bringing sort of representative sample of 100 UK citizens together to think hard about reaching net zero. Has that really had the traction that we might have hoped? How do you see that as an experiment in UK decision making?
Well, I think it was a great thing, and it was a completely new thing, really, in terms of UK democracy. Other countries have used citizens' assemblies, notably Ireland, looking at social issues like abortion, and they've been very successful. This is a kind of first attempt by the UK, so it's been quite difficult for it to get traction, particularly in a year like we've just had. The Citizens' Assembly started before the lockdowns, but then very quickly, of course, we had the lockdowns and it became very difficult to hold them face to face and so on. So I think they've coped admirably within those constraints. And what they came up with was quite clear, really. It became quite clear that there is a public appetite, not just for tackling climate change, but also for looking at national decisions on all aspects of the economy through this lens of people's well-being. rather than just the old lenses of GDP and so on. And that I think was could make quite a big difference for the future. But of course, these decisions then have to be actually fed into our political process, which is not well set up to be responsive at the moment. Our parliamentary system is not that well set up to be responsive to not just to citizens' assemblies, but it's not even very well set up to be responsive to local democracy and local decision making as well. So I think perhaps as part of a way forward, we do need to look about how democracy works in the UK as a whole.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I wonder if I could put you on the spot, Ian, because we've been talking about participation, and and Fiona talking about that democracy is an experiment and needs to be worked on. Your seminar and your emphasis was more on metrics, which sort of seem to need longer running, almost, I mean, do you see metrics as requiring a sort of top-down framework for that kind of consistency and reliability in the measures that people can all work to, or do you see the scope for bringing in kind of citizen voices for measuring and accounting for what's important?
So it was definitely argued that kind of central government currently is definitely more receptive to arguments based off of metrics, linking to what Fiona was saying earlier concerning the work of Stern with proving kind of the economic validity of policies to tackle climate change. In terms of a question for your answer and whether metrics are useful at a local level, I think for sure they are, but as you say, you need a longer term approach. You can't just use metrics for one conversation or one citizen assembly to meet over a very short period of time. It needs to be a running thing so people can really truly understand the meaning of those metrics.
Thank you. And Camille, you sort of also pointed to questions about, I mean, in your summary, you were very clear that you thought that one of the solutions lay in recognizing the knowledge that citizens have. How do you think that realization would play into the discussion we've had now about metrics and participative?
Well, I think it sort of comes in, when you're thinking about how, yes, metrics are necessary, as Ian said, but the numbers sort of cease to mean anything if there's no real voices or faces that you can attach to them to make sense of them. And so like citizens' assemblies obviously are representative of the population. And then, sorry, I've sort of lost my train of thought.
No, that's clear.
But it's a representative group in a sort of numbers sense, but also it allows a space for citizens' voices to be expressed. So in a sense, it's kind of a good combination of the two. But I think it also proves how having actual voices and discussions and letting people talk things through rather than just having, I think this links to what you were saying about metrics sort of sometimes seeming a bit more top down, because if someone comes in, measures things numerically and then leaves, it is giving a picture and it is recording issues, but it's not allowing for the same sort of fruitful discussion that those sort of forums can bring about.
Great, thank you. And thank you to people posing questions. We've got lots of good questions coming in. So panelists, if you want to pick a particular question to answer, just wave at me and I'll turn to you, because it's a bit hard for me to sort of work out who like to respond to which question? Theresa, you're waving at me.
Sorry, I just wanted to come back in to underscore that the Citizens' Assembly that we had on net zero was great. And there have been, actually I haven't read the report, there was one in France and we've had one in Ireland, and they come up with pretty similar recommendations. But this is great, but it's incredibly clunky. They're very, very expensive. They're kind of static. Whereas what we heard from Taiwan is that there are any number of platforms, open platforms. It's very agile, it's very interactive. I mean, in the UK, there are all kinds of experiments, but they're kind of closed experiments. We've got policy labs within the Cabinet Office. But wouldn't it be fantastic if those were open and say one could begin to get dialogue at that level, and those could be used as teaching resources within schools. So actually to start to have a fluency, a two-way a system of communication between citizens. Not everybody will want to engage, but actually to engage people much more on the minutiae of some of the policies that are of interest.
Thank you, Theresa. I'll turn to Fiona in a minute, but I just want to point to one of the questions in the chat, which was from Suzanne McGregor, who relates this discussion to sort of big constitutional questions in the UK, because we've talked about sort of participative democracy, we've talked about local government and central government, and clearly, you know, these are bound up with another big set of questions. So anybody that wants to pick that up is welcome to, but Fiona, you've got your electronic hand raised.
Yes, I just wanted to come in on that point because I think what Theresa said is incredibly important, and this question that Suzanne McGregor has raised draws into that as well. Our political system does have one advantage. It's rather slow and unwieldy. It's not particularly democratic because we've got the first past the post system, which doesn't really quite reflect the diversity of opinion around the UK. But we have one advantage in this country that some other countries, notably the United States, do not enjoy. And that is that climate change and environmental issues are seen in the UK as cross-party issues. We don't have the left-right divide that has been disastrous in the United States when it comes to action on climate change. You see action on climate change very strongly identified with the Democratic Party in the US, and the Republican Party taking a very anti climate change, and not just a climate skeptic, but a destructive attitude there under Donald Trump, which has been terrible. So we don't have that here, partly for historic reasons. We had Margaret Thatcher made a speech about climate change in 1988, which was a landmark moment, as she called for global action on climate change then. And so, partly for historic reasons, we don't have that burden of a left-right divide, and we need to capitalize on that. We need to try and make sure that this is an issue that has participation from all sides of politics, all parties, and that it's seen as a collaborative way forward rather than as an issue of competition between competing factions.
Thank you. Thank you. The trouble is I'm now in the business of trying to read questions and listen to answers at the same time. But thank you, Fiona. There's an important question, and I'm wondering about what the way into an answer is. There's an important question about the recovery that Fiona pointed out, the importance of a green recovery, and then sort of questions of economic justice, and how do we think about how different livelihoods will be affected by different strategies for achieving a green recovery. So Katie Cohen asks this question: how can we balance post-COVID economic recovery to improve livelihoods that have suffered the most during the pandemic and maintain environmental benefits we've seen from the shutdown? So that's the question as Katie's posed. Does anybody want to pick up that question? Theresa first, and then I'm wondering, I might see if Lucy might connect that to questions about how much, are we happy to see local government or localities make decisions if we think those are going against what is in the wider global or national interest? Because and I may even come to Fiona Harvey about Cumbrian coal mining, which is obviously a very glaring example of that in this country at the moment. But I'm just warning you, Lucy, I'd be interested in your view about how to balance that out. Theresa.
I was going to give a very brief answer. I think that we need to look at a blend of two important reports, or any number of important reports, but Bob Kerslake's from the UK 2070 Commission, which unfortunately was published in February 2020, 25th of February, just before the pandemic got going. And so that looked at geographical inequalities in the UK and made some excellent recommendations in terms of the importance of good work and looking at areas of high deprivation where very often work is based on the current economies are based on industries that undermine the climate. So as we become greener, they will lose those jobs. So talking about the need to invest in the green economy, starting in those geographical areas of the UK that are most deprived. So I would take a blend of the Kerslake 2070 UK Commission and Michael Marmot's December COVID-19 and climate change. So again, looking at the importance of good work, good education, and preserving the biodiversity and green jobs as well. So I think that there are two reports that lay it out, but we have to remember, while we're talking very much about the UK, this is an international agenda, and maybe Charlie will talk to that.
Great, thank you, Theresa. Lucy, I don't know if you want to come in. I mean, you could respond to that or any question or point that's been made so far, because I think that your point about local government and how it relates to central government and how local knowledge of contextual knowledge of the population, its needs, its history, seems to be very important throughout the discussion we've had this afternoon.
Yeah, I think related to the current conversation, I think it's actually quite important to think about framing the place and the needs of different places. So whilst, I don't know, say, this is a random example, but maybe green emissions from a certain place, we're trying to reduce it for the country as a whole, but maybe based on the demographic in a particular location, their jobs, have industry going on there, that aim needs to kind of be allowed to be different for different populations. So essentially, these things are important. They need to be controlled. I think a lot of the actual figures for example, climate change need to come from central government, but maybe how we expand that locally and how we adapt it to different localities can vary.
Thank you. What I think I'll do now is turn to Charlie Kennel. And there may be an opportunity for any on the panel to have a final word right at the end, but I'll turn to Charlie Kennel, who really has been the inspiration behind this series. So starting, I think, in 2014, with a series of lectures Charlie gave about the climate change that was, already baked in to the global system and how we should expect that to unfold and what different possible futures may lie before us, and that series of lectures Charlie gave kind of inspired then the annual series that has happened since. So Charlie, over to you. What have you made of our discussion today and over the seminar series so far?
Well, if I could have the first slide, please. I'm going unfortunately, I'm a NASA trained person and I lecture from PowerPoints. So the first one will have the logos of Christ College and CSAP. And let's see, can we move this one back to the first slide? That's the last. Good, okay, thank you. I've been given the job, an almost impossible job to do. And the job is impossible because of the inherent nature of the problem. I think one thing that we could all agree on is that the situation we face is a complex one. And there's been a gradual increase in understanding what complexity means, but it means that there are many causes and there are many outcomes, and the causes and the outcomes do not map uniquely one on another. And what that means then is it's possible to have a whole variety of points of view about the problems that we're facing and not be entirely wrong and never be entirely right. So what I've been asked to do then is to try to put into context some of the things that we've heard and that you've heard discussed so well. And in that regard, I really would like to thank both CSAP and Christ College, but also our students for making this a rich discussion and pointing out the many ways in which you can be both right and wrong. So my topic then, and we decided that we would hold this last session and look at whether or not some of the lessons that we have learned during the pandemic about how we conduct our affairs can be pertinent to the much longer range problem of climate change and ecological biodiversity decline. And so I've tried to put this in context by entitling it The 21st Century Pandemic and Anthropocene Crisis. And you'll hear from me what that means. May I have the next slide, please? I hope the shade of H.G. Wells will forgive me for borrowing a title of his, but I thought that just as Fiona has said, this particular year has been a very illuminating one. And so I'd like to put some of the things that have happened this year in context. The first is that I think we have learned that despite the fact that the Paris Agreement on climate was a diplomatic triumph, a triumph of contract decision architecture, it didn't produce the global greenhouse gas emissions reductions that we wanted. People didn't even promise at that time to enough. And it's bad enough that Bill Nordhaus, the great economist, has called it a failure. The other thing that happened in the last couple of years, the climate change community increased its capacity to identify the role that climate change plays in the complex sequence of events that leads to extreme events, wildfires, floods, and the like. And so partly as a result of that, and partly as a result of the fact that they're occurring more frequently, we now have been exceptionally aware of the number and frequency of the extreme climate events. And what was interesting to many of us in the climate community was that already advanced countries were seeing that it was difficult to respond to them. And the wildfires in California and Australia are particularly meaningful to someone who lives in California. Now, the interesting thing is that we begin to see multiple string disasters. And my iconic example is the wildfires in Australia. Climate change prepared the way in terms of drought. The fires occurred. The air pollution from the wildfire smoke threatened public health. And the fires compromised biodiversity in that we read that billions of animals fled the fire. So here was one risk that we think of as climate change, another risk as we think of public health and air pollution, and a third risk to biodiversity, all occurring as a result of the same complex event. And I think the interesting thing from the scientific and policy community is that we have in the past studied them as though they were separate. Now, each of these areas has its passionate advocates for immediate action. And the reason is that each plausibly extrapolates separately on its own, just let it go and it'll run, and it will lead you to mortal risk. And the climate models are the clearest about it. The business as usual trajectory, which we're close to, will produce economic and social stress around the world in almost every region, but some of them will become empty quarters, like in Arabia, that are hostile to the existence of all life. So let's have the next slide, please. So I wondered how you could phrase this concatenation of risks and describe it. And I found that my colleague, Paul Kuntson, who used to visit us frequently at Scripps, found a name for it. He thought that the human imprint on the surface of the earth was so profound that in the future, geologists digging down into the rubble of our civilization would discover that we had created a new geological era that he called the Anthropocene. And during this era, as I've indicated before, potentially mortal ecological, climate, and public health trends are unfolding simultaneously. These trends, the question is, how strong will their convergence be in the future? And if there's to be a strong convergence in which they all act together in a serious way and cannot be untangled, then it will happen at the high population era of the demographic transition that's already in progress, the time of peak population in the peak global population. And the question is, if we are to prepare for this, then we're going to have to change our thinking. We're going to have to require conceptualization and management that internalizes the synergism of these three threats, and probably many others, but certainly to work on the interaction between threats. Next one, please. So let's talk for a moment about the demographic transition. It provides a different cut through the same complex issue. People have talked about in the last 10 or so years in the policy literature about a great acceleration, the great increase in population and prosperity that occurred directly after the First World War, partly as a result of the industrialization that occurred at that time. But what this means is there's a shift from predominance, a shift from a predominance of low prosperity societies with low birth rate, low prosperity societies with high birth rate and low life expectancy, to the opposite, high prosperity society, low birth rates, and high life expectancy. And so far as we can tell, that's about halfway through. We've been in it now for about 50 to 60 years, and it could be another length of time, according to demographic positions, in which the same length of time will pass, and then the global population will stabilize and possibly even decline. And so as a result, what we're seeing is an international world that's a mosaic of countries, and within countries, communities, as have already been pointed out in the case of the UK, in different levels of economic and stages of social equilibrium. That makes it easier to see the reality, if you will, that inequality and division have been exacerbated between those who have been pushed ahead and those that are left behind, and between countries, and also within communities. So now, what in this world of transition with the mosaic of societies at different stages, it's possible to entertain differing views about the state of the planet and not be wrong. That, in fact, is a property of a complex system. The economist Thomas Piketty and psychologist Steven Pinker look at the globe as a whole and at the population of the globe, and they see the increase in life expectancy and world prosperity of the last two generations since the Great Acceleration, and they call it a global social good. And so it is. In many ways, social justice murder rates, and so forth, as Pinker will document, have all of these things that were social bads are declining as we speak, despite what we see in the media. However, the scientific community, with its own data and its own ways of establishing knowledge, sees mass species extinctions on the size of the ones that occurred in other big transitions between geological eras. We see a climate destabilized, and we are seeing increased pandemic risk. But others look at the inequality and division that in our world, and they see it paralyzing the political collective on these emerging threats. And so then the question then is, when these multiple views converge, as they will during the great conversion of multiple threats, great convergence of multiple threats, what then should we do? Next slide, and final. So I was asked to reflect upon what we might have learned from our seminars and how it's possible that the things that, under what extent could the things that we learned about in our seminars from the pandemic also be transferred and translated to planetary health. And so I think one of the big debates that we saw, I'm going to raise what we've learned not as a conclusion, but as questions that we must continue to investigate. We first of all asked ourselves the question, should we think globally and act locally? Or should we think locally and act globally? Which one? Which direction does the flow of knowledge and motivation flow? There was a reasonable answer, and that is all of the above. So, but articulating the question a little bit more, one of the questions I have in the United States, especially with the new administration, can countries design approaches to national security that recognize the interdependence of human and planetary security? This actually means, should we involve our national security apparatus, evolve from a national and economic and military framework to a global human security framework? And isn't that what we have to achieve at some point? And then a big question was, how do we explain it all to the people who have to make the decision? Or since this will be a lesson for the future, how are embeddings of ethical advance, like our understanding that we should not destroy the living things around us, how are embeddings of ethical advance in intellectual advance, like the Dasgupta review, best translated with action? What do we do? What words do we use? What concepts do we use? What technologies do we use? What decision technologies do we use? That was a big preoccupation of this seminar. But I suppose everybody was asking, can't we extract something of value from this pandemic? Can't we build better and fairer, build back better? What this actually means is embedding capacities one by one that build social and planetary resilience in our governance. It was stated, interestingly enough, that democracy was a technology that is subject to continuous improvement. Can we embed social justice in technologies, communications? But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think we only have about 50 years, 75 years to do it. So can we do these things? Can we create a systemic change in society, fast in our global society, fast enough to avoid crises that could become unmanageable in interaction? And we have about 2 human generations to do this, which is why I think I am very thankful and very, very, very grateful to our students who are of the generation that will need to cope with this problem. And I think their thought is the most important that we've heard today, with all due respect to the other speakers.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you very much. Well, our time is up. I think it's an indicator of the fact that we've done a good job of raising the important issues to the surface, that we feel that our time is insufficient to really get into it. But I just want to say, perhaps I'll give Fiona a very, very last word in case she has any final thought, but I'm afraid we don't have time for much more than that. So huge thank you to the students, Ian, Alice, Lucy and Camille for your work throughout the series and for your really fascinating and thoughtful discussions this afternoon. Thank you, of course, to Charlie, who's a great friend of Christ College and Cambridge, for stimulating the series as a whole and that really thought-provoking kind of summation. So that's thank you to all of you, and goodbye from me, and the final word to Fiona.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I thought that was such a fruitful discussion, and thank you so much, Charlie, for your great words at the end, giving us global momentous the next few years are going to be, because we've really got to deal with these problems now. We've heard such a large amount over many years now. We have amassed so much knowledge, and we really do have a global will. I think if you ask people, ordinary people across the world, they are concerned about climate change. They do want action on these issues, and so now really is the time to do it, and I think we all need to play a part in that. Our students today have showed how they can, and I think that it's up to all of us to think exactly how we can feed in this, and not just through our individual actions, not just through turning off the lights or anything like that, but actually through making a difference in the messages that we send to our politicians and our decision makers, and through feeding into those decisions.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, everyone else, and thank you for participants for joining us. See you next year when we'll be back. And I've also posted in the chat links to another series that's a sort of partner series of this that will be starting shortly. It's convened by Trinity College, and the next one will be on the 10th of March. So if you're go there for more of this kind of stuff. But thank you all very much, and goodbye.